Welcome to the CyberTide podcast. In each episode, Adlumin hosts guests from across the security industry to dive beneath the headlines and explore the cyber attacks, industry trends, and how small to medium businesses can protect themselves from cyber risk. I'm your host, Mark Sangster, strategist with Adlumin and author of No Safe Harbor, the inside truth about cybercrime and how to protect your business. On this episode, we look forward to 2024 in terms of cyber risk, threats, and technological innovations. Adlumin's Chief Product Officer, Jessvin Thomas, joins me to share his perspective on the coming year. He's a passionate innovator and change agent with 20 plus years of experience in cybersecurity, scaling startups, and achieving product, market, and sales motion fit. Before Adlumin, Jessvin was the Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Barracuda's Managed XDR division. Jessvin, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Mark, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. I mean, you and I obviously we've done a lot of work together already in a very short period of time. So I'm looking forward to our conversation here. You're always an animated speaker, and you've got a lot of great insight into the industry, both from obviously your previous experience, and some of the things you see coming, and how you're mapping that to what Adlumin's going to do over the next 12 months.
Yeah, it'll be a fun conversation. I think, the hard part will be keeping in the time, Mark. I know when you and I get started, who knows when it ends.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's yes, exponential inertia. So let's start with a quick background for everybody. So I mentioned that you were at Barracuda and Cyber Eyesight, I believe that was. So tell us a little bit about the experience over the decades where you've been in cybersecurity.
Yeah, well, the funny thing I'll start with is how I got into cybersecurity in the first place. Because you see, I've done all these things in cyber. Honestly, when I got out of school, I just needed a job. I graduated and I had done math and statistics and things like that, and I was in operations research. And the big job there was either going to Walmart and doing supply chain stuff, or going into investment banking, which I know is probably a lot more lucrative, but for some reason I wasn't interested in the business of money. And then I had these interviews with a cyber consulting company that just said, hey, it wasn't even called cyber then. I think it was just computer security stuff. And it just seemed like solving problems. And they told me they'd pay me while they trained me. And I'm like, yeah, sure, sign me up. So that's kind of how I got into the industry. But then over time, I've done everything from being a firewall administrator to a security analyst, to investing in cybersecurity and things like that. And most recently, I had been part of a startup called Scout Cybersecurity, which we ended up sold to Barracuda, and the team's doing great there. And that's where I was a CTO there for a little while on that, continue to grow the business. And I just had an itch to continue to be an entrepreneur. And so I took some time off. I was started working on another startup called Cyber Eyesight. But actually, at the same time, I decided to do something which I guess was sort of a lifelong dream, and I didn't even know it. But I actually ran a coffee shop, and I still continue to own the coffee shop. It's one of those old school 90s style coffee shops. We've got vinyl records and used
Mhm.
books and all that stuff. There's probably nothing healthy there. It's all coffee and carbs basically. But no QR codes, no,
Yeah.
none of those things, old paper menus and stuff. And it was just a really great time to, you work in cyber on a computer. It was great to just work with people and be in a business that ties to that. It's definitely not the most lucrative thing in the world. I tell people, when they take time off, they spend their money on a golf membership or something fun. I spent my money on more work. So I look at it that way, but it's really great. Gave me a chance to step back, and then when I've talked to the team at Adlumin and what they were doing, it was just really interesting.
Yeah, I love the fact that I perused the website. So I love the fact that the coffee shop is it's kind of like the old style analog coffee shop, if you know what I mean, both literally
Right.
and figuratively, which I think is fantastic. Because you're right, it's a good kind of juxtaposition to what we do on a daily basis, which is certainly more abstract. And you mentioned coming to Adlumin, so tell us a little bit about how that kind of came to be, and what you saw in the company, because I know having spent 10 years kind of in the managed detection and response category before Adlumin. I saw the good, I saw the things that if I could go back in time I would do differently. I mean, that's one thing that drew me to Adlumin was I think some of the problems that I didn't have the foresight to see a decade ago, they did, and they had solved in a shorter period of time. And to me that was really encouraging. That was an indicator, I think, of future success. And of course that's all proven out by the the growth in the customer base. So what did you see, and what led you here?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely similar to what you said is just like I see. First of all, I think a team that's really focused on practical outcomes.
Hmm.
I'm a technologist myself. I write code. I like to develop, and I'm really interested in AI and all those things. But like I mentioned about even joining cyber, like I didn't get into cyber for its own sake. I got into frankly because I needed a practical outcome, which was money. But in the same way, I really enjoy working in the mid market where you're focused on customers that have day to day things they need to do every day, and you're trying to innovate to make that work, like not just for its own sake. And I saw the same culture and style at Adlumin, and I did feel like one of the next things that people run into all the time, whether you're in small business or big business, is that you have all this stuff. Like you feel like you need to do security, you need to get all this stuff. You need to have an MDR and a SIM and vulnerability management and patches and all these things. And you're just like, yeah, God, like I got more stuff. I don't even know if I'm using it all, and it's not
Yeah.
still people are still getting hacked. So like, is this stuff even worth it? And I think like, the core idea behind Adlumin is that you really need to bring all of these things together and apply your effort to where it's most useful. So whether that's security awareness or vulnerability management or just basic, alert response or just stale accounts. And that's kind of the idea that I saw behind Adlumin that I really liked. And it's funny you talked about being an MDR for 10 years. I mean, same for me. And I think it's one of those you either love it or you don't. You work on it for a while and then you're like, God, this is so hard, man. And you're kind of burned out and then you go to a coffee shop and all that stuff. But then you get some time off, you start thinking about it, you're like, "Man, like, if I only had a chance to do it this way or that way, I
Hmm.
could make it so much better."
Yeah.
And, that's what I find it at Lumen too, is like we're right back in that perfect spot of, we're growing and we're working with customers and we're doing practical outcomes, and we still have the room to figure out, all right, how could we do something that actually helps customers? How could we make it better? And that's that kind of way of thinking and entrepreneurial spirit is what, I would say fundamentally drew me here.
Yeah, the same. I mean, I knew one of the founders, Tim Evans, and then quickly came to know Robert Johnston, the other founder, and it really was their kind of their energy, the culture that they created, their view of the world, I think, and the view of working, and the fact that they were solid practitioners, right? They had seen these challenges before in different form of life, right? Back in the military and with the NSA, and were able to translate, I think, those lessons into the private sector, which is often not hard to, or sorry, it's very hard to do, right? It's tough to take kind of some of the methodologies, access to resources, and so on, and apply it in a model that works differently where it is a sort of a profit first, and I think they've done that successfully, particularly in the small to medium sized businesses that we've seen now, the ones that are struggling. And I always say this is, it's unfortunate that the headlines always draw our attention to the big firms, the household brands, and these major billion-dollar kind of breaches. And unfortunately, that's the tip of the iceberg, right? The majority of the impact, unfortunately, is felt by these small to medium-sized businesses like small banks and community hospitals and industry like that. And they're the ones we never read about in the headlines, right? So they kind of go along, and unfortunately means those other businesses don't get to learn, right? There's no vicarious opportunity, I guess, for vicarious learning. But let's look forward for a sec. So, I threw out the $1 billion marker there, and I'm just reading Cybersecurity Ventures is claiming that cybercrime is predicted to cost the world almost $10 trillion in 24. That's a mind-boggling number, and even I'm a little skeptical on that one. I'm not trying to say that the size of the problem isn't enormous. It is, but that's quite a number. And they're claiming, even Forbes claims, that it will even grow about 15% over the next year. By the end of 2025, it'll be around 10 trillion is the cost. So, what do you think is driving this kind of, bull market when it comes to cybercrime?
It's really just the value. So I think what makes it so hard to figure out like the losses and whether it's 10 trillion or $1 is
Hmm.
that, a lot of it's sometimes potential loss, brand awareness or things like
Right.
that. And so how the difficulty is connecting the real world, real dollars and cents and impacts to the virtual world where, website goes down or something happens. But I think that's what tied to making it increase is that independent of cybersecurity, the real world is getting more and more fundamentally wired to the virtual world and vice versa. And so it's funny, like I just got a electric vehicle this year,
Mhm.
and it just I've been talking for a while about in the automotive industry, and we joke of how it's really just a computer on wheels. And now you go, I mean, even more so, so what
Yeah.
happens if, for whatever reason, I can't there's all these controls and things like I tried to, unplug the charger or something like that. And the charger is set to have, whether it's allowed to be open or closed or controlled by my phone. You're like, now I control the car by the phone. And it's like, well, what happens if that charger can't charge the car? It's not like, oh, I can just store this gas tank of gas in the background or, whatever it is. And so I think the real world is getting connected. If you look at ransomware as an example, like why has ransomware been so impacting? And it's because it's hitting the availability part of CIA. Like it turns out the confidentiality part and the integrity part, while it ties to the real world, it hasn't tied in a visceral enough way, but availability has. You can't order something from Amazon or you can't buy something, or you see all these recently there's been all those title companies and things like that, and it means, hey, if you've ever bought a house or something, it feels like everybody gets the most important things done in the last 60 minutes of the transaction. Like you're putting this giant check out there, and you're waiting for this title to come to you. And if
Yeah.
you disrupt that one moment, I mean, it really impacts you just mentally. And so I think that's what's really driving this is the continuing connection between the real world and the cyber world, and then therefore the value or the gap on the value that's associated with that.
Yeah, my my daughter's right, my younger daughter, she's 18 and she's got, I think she's like a three device person, you know what I mean? She's watching TV, she's on her laptop doing homework, and she's got her phone texting. And I don't think she can disconnect. And you're right. The more I think the fundamental or the core infrastructure of our lives, right? So, like, can you drive your car to work, as an example, or to go pick up your children from school, or whatever it might be? As that's affected because of some sort of cyber outage, that's a mass change over the idea that, okay, well, I'm going to have to wait another 2 hours to go on, online in my bank to, commit some kind of transaction. That isn't game ending or game stopping. But what we're talking about here with that, that sort of digital disruption and the fact that it permeates every facet of our life, if your car won't operate, is a completely different scale of issue than it is with, let's say your old digital book, on a tablet. Well, okay, with an analog book, you can pick it up and you can read it. Perhaps eyeglasses for the elderly, but other than that, there's no technology required. And now there is on everything. And so you sort of touched on an example there, which is, industrial IoT, that I would call it, Internet of Things, and some of the vulnerabilities. We've also seen that in other areas with utilities as an example, and healthcare, right? Patient wearable devices, tracking, monitoring, facilities management tools, and so on. Do you think those kind of organizations, and I'm not just trying to pick on healthcare here, but do you think the IoT connected businesses truly understand the scale of the threat and how how they've increased the size of the threat profile by connecting things to the internet?
Yeah, I think there's understanding and there's feeling. So I think they understand it, but the feeling of what that actually means is probably not there yet. And I liken it to like there's a book that I love called The Singularity is Near. And it's all about like human evolution and all these other
Mm,
things. But out of it, one of the phrases that I really like is that progress in our civilization, progress in technology, progress, all of that stuff is exponential. And the problem with exponential is it's just not something the human mind is designed to conceive of. And it starts out an exponential curve. If you're really looking at that curve in the beginning, it looks linear. Like it looks like,
mm,
1, 2, 3, like it's just like, or
yeah.
1, 2, 4, whatever. It just looks linear. And but only when it's already going too fast do you realize the impact. And I think that's what's going to happen with IoT is that, it starts out where it's linear and it's sort of theoretical, but going back to, the whole wiring to the real world, like the true impact I think hasn't been there. And unfortunately, as human beings, we probably react to crises better than we react to, the potential for a crisis. And I think that's what's going to happen to cause that to say, all right, this is something we really need to look at, because truly there are other risks that people are working on, just like the pandemic, right? Pandemic risk, actually, cancers and allergies and all these other things. And so cyber risk is one of those risks along with one of the others. And if you say like the likelihood of patient death is higher through lack of sterilization of tools, or there was a an awesome book about that, about how people get sick through the ER. I can't remember what the book is, but if you compare all those risks together, you're like, well, wait a second. Like, I don't know. Like, it seems like if I have a cyber risk, all I have to do is, get identity protection or, whatever thing with my social security number or cancel my credit card. But if I don't really manage the ER room right, like there's actual death. I think when that starts flipping, if it starts flipping, like we don't want it to flip, but the theory is that it will. I think that's when it's really going to be a problem. And unfortunately, we're going to see the problem get worse before it gets better, because then we're going to have to back up all these things we've done that have created this exponential exposure, so that we can get a handle on it.
Yeah, and how you walk those back, I think, is going to be a real challenge. And you're right, unfortunately, when it comes to human nature, and there's a whole study on this, right? And a lot in risk management is an example that shows that, right, that we are we are good at reacting to specific sort of sensory things like physical danger. Standing on the edge of a cliff, we all get the heebie-jeebies, and we have that fear of falling. But in something as abstract as many of the sort of the cyber threats that we face, we just don't treat it the same way. And years ago, I remember I worked with the president of the American Bar Association, and I said, how are all these things going on in the world, right? Like, how is it that we deal with things like human trafficking and arms dealing and drugs and all these kind of things, and yet cybercrime just doesn't get the same kind of attention. And I think part of it is because, of course, all parties are kind of actively doing it to each other. But what he talked about was this lack of an international, what they called leveling of punishment, right? Was this notion of we just can't get ourselves to see it as having the same order of magnitude of risk and impact, and because of that, we're not going to treat it the same way, right? We're always going to see it as some kind of secondary thing until, as you say, we get to that point. And as Churchill once said, post World War II, right? Never let a good crisis go to waste. And hopefully we will at some point learn from this. Another area where we can talk about, have we, open Pandora's box or let the genie out of the bottle, or pick your other metaphor that you want to throw in the blender here, is artificial intelligence. So I see this as a bit of a double-edged sword. So what's your take on AI in terms of, AI based attacks and how that can enable criminals? And then also from a cybersecurity perspective, as the defenders, how we can protect ourselves against those attacks using AI.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, I think to me, AI truly is a major revolution. And I really believe that this isn't like, when blockchain was a big thing and there were all these fads like that, those I weren't on, but this to me is like the browser. And so that's what makes this different. So if you were to ask the same question about the browser or the internet,
Hmm.
how will the browser or the internet enable adversaries or enable defenders? I think it's the same kind of question. The browser, the internet enabled adversaries because they are able to project attacks beyond their physical location, and they were able to multiply at scale at very low cost, increasing sets of attacks. On the defenders, though, they were able to increase their resources, understand what's going on. I mean, how much do you learn about cybersecurity through YouTube and things like that, right?
That's
So
right.
I think AI is going to be the same way. It's going to be a multiplying effect, and it's going to lower the cost of doing business in general, whether that business is an adversarial business, whether that business is, a positive business. I think it's going to lower the cost of doing that and increase the range and the ability to do something faster, and therefore, get out the coverage, I guess, increase the coverage of it in a way that we haven't been able to do before. So I think that threat is real. I'm less worried about the actual, like, inhibiting AI to do something, more of just the basics of, like, if I had to throw a rock to break something, now I could throw a lot more rocks and find better rocks, and people who didn't know where to get rocks from can find it faster, like.
Yeah.
But at the
Yeah.
same time, I think we have to use that on the defender side. Like, we have to, everybody that doesn't have an AI plan, or a way to incorporate AI into what they're doing, I think they're going to be chasing optimizing, you know, something. They're optimizing their current way of working and not using this sort of fundamental, evolution to just change the game entirely. And it's a similar way that I see of, like, if you were looking at syslog all the time and just parsing syslog all day, and you weren't looking at how to use events and how to combine them, and how to normalize data and things like that, it's like, and you just spent your time fixing your syslog. I think that's what's going to happen with AI. If you're just looking at the way you do things today and you're not looking at like how to take advantage of this, and that means changing the way we do things very much. I think it's going to ultimately be a problem. But I definitely think it's going to increase the capability of the attacker without a doubt.
Certainly over the last few years, I've seen a lot of good, I think, early implementations of AI in terms of detections, for example. I think of things like remote administrative attacks. So using PowerShell as an example. And unfortunately, I think for the human analyst, sometimes distinguishing between what looks like sort of normal remote administrative activity versus something that's not and is potentially malicious is hard to detect. And I think it can do a really good job of countering that. And then it also, I think, can escalate, or sorry, yeah, it can escalate the response in that sense too, because if you're doing the kind of, let's call it the preliminary sort of footwork in the investigation, it means a lot of that kind of mechanics doesn't have to be replicated by the analyst, and the analyst can turn to other factors and then determine whether or not they have to take some kind of containment action. So we've certainly, I've certainly seen a development, like I said, over the last probably 3 to 5 years, and I know there'll be a lot more to come. And you're right. I think like anything, right? Whether it's the stone, the wheel, the sword, and it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. That's probably just really a sentiment of perspective. But without getting too philosophical, right? I think while yes, it will accelerate attacks in some ways, and it allows them to do things like A, B to Z test phishing, lures and figuring out which ones are most effective. At the same time, it allows us to do the same to counter, right? So I do think there'll be a strong emphasis there. And as you said, as you talked about that kind of like hockey stick, right, logarithmic scale in the innovation of technology and the adoption of technology, we can't do that with people, right? There's just no way to linearly continually to somehow train, hire, and deploy SOC analysts, right? I mean, and you see that now. I mean, you're running our managed services and our security operations center. um, how do you think AI and humans play together there?
So I think, one of the mantras that I drive is that, first of all, I think every SOC analyst, every cybersecurity person is going to have to think like a software engineer. And when I say like a software engineer, it's not just about writing code. It's about, you know, putting something into a machine, seeing how the machine operates, and then seeing if the results match what you wanted in the first place. And so today, we basically do that with SOC analysts. We're putting SOC analysts into jobs that machines are better at. I look at like, just think like when a SOC analyst looks at something, they're looking at an alert on a two-dimensional screen with, maybe they have a large screen, but there's a limit to that screen. Whereas the machine can see a lot more context and many more dimensions. And so I
Mhm.
think where I think we're going to have to evolve is not that the analyst goes away. It's that what their job is different, that they have to be constantly, you can't separate like, oh, model creation and automation is done by these other guys. They're these data science guys I don't know anything about, and they create stuff, and then I it gets put in front of me and I look at it. I think that the SOC analyst job is going to become, let me look at the data in a larger way. What are all the things that are coming in? How are they operating? And am I getting something good out of this? Am I setting false positives, true positives? Am I taking action or not? And then based on that, learn on, okay, how can I update the machine to do better? And then let the machine, do its thing, and then look at the results and see if it got it if it got any better, and then adjust. In some ways, I think of it like quantitative trading. So there was a point in time where everybody was on the trading floor yelling at each other about what the best price should be or this or that. And it's not like, has the game changed there? Absolutely. But have people who trade commodities and trade things gone away? No. What they're doing is informing models, and those guys that are quantitative analysts work closely with those guys who understand the commodities business, and try to combine the two and figure out, okay, how can we do better on a trade? And I think those are the things that we don't look at today, which is like on a trade, it's, you can measure, okay, did I make profit? Did I not make profit?
Right.
But today we're not doing that in terms of feedback. Our only feedback is, how big is our queue? Did our queue get down faster? What's our SLA? I mean, I could make the SLA quick, just send everything out, right? You won't even
Yeah.
know if you did a good job or not. So I think those are the things where we're going to have to change, is like how we measure our acceptance criteria, how we measure quality, and how we think of the analyst as really analyzing. and pushing that data into the machine and letting the machine see what happens. And maybe even looking historically, like what if we had operated this way? What would have happened?
Yeah.
And that's where I see even within Adluminus moving the direction of what we do.
Yeah, it's kind of that flight simulator replay of an incident, right? And seeing whether you can avoid it. And speaking of quants, it's kind of back to the Monte Carlo simulations and trying binomials and trinomials and so on, right? I think those aren't being applied in cybersecurity and can be. On the development side, Jessvin, what do you see happening kind of in the DevSecOps world, right? We've seen a lot of what I'd kind of call poisoning the well type of attacks, right? The going after the SolarWinds, the Kaseyas. We've seen it with Move It, LastPass, right? Again and again, they're kind of going after the software that we trust and using that to exploit their customer base. So, how do you think that's going to change over the next year when it comes to companies securing up their code?
I think software supply chain is going to become a real issue. And I think that, even I think there's a lot, it's almost like the way IPv4 was developed without
Right.
security. So I can tell you that like one of my, a bunch of developers might kill me. I started out in Java, but one of my favorite things is actually JavaScript, which people look at as less like a scripting language. And it's something that was developed over 3 days. But the work that's been put into JavaScript and what's made it, I think, very powerful for a lot of developers is the whole NPM ecosystem, similar to the Python ecosystem that exists. But there's not a lot of controls on those things. And I give you an example that had nothing to do with the hacker that is from a couple of years ago, I think, where there was a guy that had written like this really, it's called left pad. It's this really basic function that, pads a bunch of, if you have a string and you want to pad it with a zero at the front, you left pad it and it was utilized by some function or feature, something. And so all these guys basically were using left pad and didn't know it because they were using some like React from Facebook to build some great UI, and React depended on something and that depended on left pad. And it turned out that for whatever reason, the developer of left pad, there were a variety of reasons behind it, but he wanted to remove his stuff. He just didn't want to put it out there anymore. In the open source, there's whole history behind it. You can look it up. But
Mhm.
anyway, he decided to remove left pad. So he removed left pad and like half the internet broke because all these packages depended on this left pad
Of
package
course.
and you tie down to it and it's like even it came down to like the history was around like who has the naming rights over something and that had nothing to do with the adversary, but it tells you how brittle it is that one guy over here can take out a program that only had like 10, 15 lines of code and impact so many people. As the attacker starts to get into that more because they're just going to keep going on the easiest thing to do, we're going to start running into, wow, we've made a lot of significant progress. We can write a lot of code really fast because we can depend on a lot of other people's version of code. But how the heck do we figure out what's right to use and what's not right to use? We don't want to go back to everybody has to reinvent the wheel all the time, write the same code over and over and over again. We need to work as a community. But how do we figure out what's a secured community and what's a verified community? We know, the days of certificate management and stuff tells us like there's no way we can perfectly figure this out through some, perfectly top down way. We need to find a community oriented way that will help us scale. But I think if left pad is any indication, poisoning these packages and things like that is something that we're just going to have one of those things where we don't even realize, going back to IoT, this one simple IoT, utilize some package to do something and nobody knew and there was no way to perfectly figure it out and all of a sudden it broke. I
Yeah.
think we may see it in 2025, we may see it some other way, but I think it's another one of those exponential problems.
Now, I mentioned SolarWinds in the lead up to that question. So we saw back in the late fall that Tim Brown, the CISO for SolarWinds, was personally charged by the SEC with fraud and failure to control. So, um, without getting into the details of that, how do you think that kind of legal action against a specific individual, how do you think that's going to affect the role of the CISO across the board? And, in particular with our customers, they're not public companies for the most part, right? They're smaller organizations, but, what kind of knock on effect do you think it has for them?
It's going to be really hard to say. I think that, CISOs struggle with, where when you're in a risk management game, you're like kind of like, do you cry wolf? Do you say like we all know we're not perfect. We all know that there's issues. And where does that judgment lie? Does that judgment lie with the CISO? Does that judgment lie with somebody else? Or even what's the level at which you need to say like, hey, my judgment says we're not doing something right, and either I could be part of this or can't be part of this. I think that's going to be the big question for CISOs. That's already been a question. This just reminds them of that. Whether that's going to continue to be something just like SOX, where people have to sign off on stuff and a CISO has to sign off of something on a publicly traded company. Even if you're private, where it all happens again, going back to supply chain, it happens through supply chain. So I remember this happened even with basic security safeguards. What started happening is Netflix, as a large organization, started requiring their content providers to have better security because content was being stolen. And now all of a sudden, these small mom and pop shops of
Mhm.
like 10, 15 guys are doing video editing and video content now on Macs that had no centralized authentication or whatever needed to put in security because they couldn't secure this contract if they couldn't do it. And we see the same thing obviously in CMMC and DoD and things like that. So I
Right.
think that's where it's going to start to come down is it's going to be just as easy to push on your suppliers to say, hey, someone has signed off on privacy, someone has signed off on
Yeah.
security, someone has signed off on something. That's actually, I think, going to be the harder thing than even the SEC coming in on private companies, because it's just going to be easier to do, and there's going to be less pushback, and that's going to put those guys that are not even CISOs, they're the IT manager saying, hey, can you just sign off on this document? Hey, we agree, we're following all the right security things. I think that's where it's really going to start to be challenging as those things are put into contracts, those things are put into insurance, and somebody's going to ask for validation and sign off. I think we're going to see that increase. Much we see that in 2024. I don't think we're going to, I think you're going to see more anecdotes in 2024, but I think you're going to see more systematic impact, probably further down. But people are definitely going to be thinking about it.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I don't know if we're going to see things like a security officer, particularly in a public company, for example, start to fall under, directors and officers insurance, D&O insurance, which, they're not typically a fiduciary office of the company, so they wouldn't be covered by that. Or do they go get malpractice insurance or something along those lines? But I do think it's going to be what you're talking about. This will be the first move, is the kind of the transfer of liability, right? That idea of, we're going to make sure that everyone within our ecosystem and that supply stream has actually done what they've claimed to do, and putting a name to it. So it be an interesting period of time. And like all these things, it does, as you say, it takes time to play out, particularly with the SEC. These things drag on for years, and investigations and audits take time to become recommendations. Recommendations take time to be validated and actually turned into rules. Like those SEC rules that just came into play last year, they had been on the books now for 3-4 years out in the wild until they finally came to be in the form that they are. So facing all of this, because we are sort of running out of time here, is, what's the one thing you would recommend that our type of customer base, small organizations, medium sized organizations, can do to protect themselves against these kind of threats and risks?
I think a lot of it is still a lot of the basics. So first of all, I always say with anything, you've got to recognize there's a problem. If the number one thing is to think like it may not feel like it right now, but it is going to become a problem. Whether it's because your customers ask for it, your vendors ask for it, you run into a problem. It's to the level of just like cash flow. It's going to be start to become as important as that. I think number two, once you recognize that it's a problem, I still think the basics are the most important, which is who is responsible for looking at this problem. Whether it's if you're so small, it's you as the owner, or you assign it to your CFO, or you assign it to an IT manager or something. Someone's got to have both the authority and the visibility to be able to take action on this and provide information. Not just somebody. It's like, oh, I put it down there and I'll never hear about it again. That's actually success. You got to flip authority with accountability. And then I think it becomes, some of the basics of understanding patching, understanding, endpoint protection, and still secure. As much as people security awareness, it goes in vogue, it goes out of vogue. Just the other day, I had something where I went to a website that actually looked legit to me. I think I was doing some kind of search, and it found me information, and I went there, and then I noticed on my phone that I was getting these alerts that my Google account had been hacked. And you know
Oh,
what? I almost fell for it. I
yeah.
almost fell for it. There's only one other time I fell for something, and it had to do with somebody sending me a LinkedIn message. But this one was, I realized what was happening is there was a website that was sending me a notification. I probably accepted cookies or accepted notification, and was sending me a notification with a Google icon that was saying my
Ah,
my thing was hacked. And probably if I clicked on that phone notification, it would have sent me a website to log into Google. And I'm sure I would have stopped it there, but I almost clicked on it. And so it's going from, we joke from the old Nigerian scam from forever
Mhm.
ago that wasn't spelled right, whatever, to now it's like these Office 365 FedEx emails. Now it's like, notifications through something because you're supposed to accept cookies. So I think security awareness thing is going to continue to become important. It's going to continue to evolve. It's going to go from phishing emails to phones to whatever. So I'd say those are the four most important things. Is number one, you know, agree there's a problem or identify that there's a problem. Number two, assign accountability that also has authority. Number three, understand your endpoints and what those basic computing machines that you use to do work all the time are. And number four, security awareness. Make sure your people that are a big part of it understand that's important. Now, if you're a tech company and you've got an e-commerce business and things, there's a million other things that you need to do, or I shouldn't say a million. There's still basic things to do there. But let's just say you feel like you're a non-technical company that's just doing basic things day to day. I'd say that's where your biggest areas are to feel comfortable about.
You know what I love about that question is you didn't go to any technology. It wasn't use a VPN and multi-factor authentication and all the kind of basics, which are important, by the way. But I love that you took that higher risk-based kind of view. So we are sort of out of time here. So I'm going to ask one final question. Your final thought of the day is, what's the quote or rule by which you kind of navigate your life?
It probably changes day to day and how I'm feeling, one way or the other, I guess.
Yeah.
But I will tell you the quote. I'm looking up at my wall here, and the quote that I do have on my wall is, "Imagination is more important than perfect knowledge." And I'm an engineer, and I did math in school and things like that. And you're always chasing, like, is this right? Is this wrong? Is this
Mhm.
correct or not? But I try to remind myself all the time that, in life, we should be thinking much bigger than that. So imagination is more important than perfect knowledge is probably my quote.
Agreed. That's fabulous. Well, Jessvin, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today, and again, thank you for your insight. And um, and I know this is not going to be the last podcast. This was the first, but I certainly feel that you and I are going to be doing a lot more work like this together because it's the kind of I think the conversations, the insight that you bring. I love the kind of perspective that you have because it isn't just you. You have the technical, but it's not just that, right? It's the looking at the sort of the larger business lessons that occur as well. So, thank you very much.
It was a lot of fun, Mark. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Cyber Tide with Mark Sangster. Today we were joined by Jessvin Thomas, Adlumin Chief Product Officer. Join us for future episodes in which we invite more experts to reveal the contributing factors and costs of cyber incidents and how your firm can protect itself from business-disrupting cyber attacks. For more information about Adlumin or for a demo, visit adlumin.com.